Welcome to today's webinar titled Step 5 of the 5-Step Program Improvement Process, presented by Mimi Lufkin. My name is Greg Nagy, and I am the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour, and is being recorded in order to view this presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available in the next few days on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you'll be watching the presenter present slides through the WebEx interface while listening to them talk over your phone. If you cannot get the WebEx software to work today, you can download today's slides from the homepage of the stemequitypipeline.org website and follow along using your phone. All the attendees' phones have been automatically muted. The presenter will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation and during the Q&A, you may submit a question by typing it in the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your WebEx screen. The presenter or I will read and respond to these questions at the end of the presentation. I would like to start the webinar by introducing Mimi Lufkin, CEO, National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity Education Foundation. Mimi?
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good late morning to those of you on the West Coast. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm looking forward to doing this webinar and certainly completing the the series on the 5-step process. The great thing is that we now will have these 5 webinars archived so that in the future anyone who's working on this can go and review these. So here we go. As I usually do at each of these presentations, let me just give a quick overview of the project. So for those of you who maybe this is the first time you've been involved, this may be new to you, but the STEM Equity Pipeline is a project of the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity Education Foundation. It's funded by the National Science Foundation through their Human Resource Directorate, specifically their Gender and Science and Engineering program. It is an extension services grant modeled basically after the Agricultural Cooperative Extension Service, with the intention that we work primarily with others who will then pass on the information that the training that they've received from us to others, sort of a train-the-trainer model. There are 3 goals in the project. The first is to build the capacity of the formal education community to integrate gender equity into STEM education and professional development in the states in which we're working. The second is to institutionalize those implemented strategies by connecting them with existing accountability systems. And in this case, because of our work primarily in the career and technical education system, there are measures in the federal legislation that funds career and technical education that deal with increasing the participation and completion of students in non-traditional career and tech ed, and certainly that means women in STEM-related CTE programs. So there's a connection with the accountability system in Perkins to this work. And thirdly, to broaden the commitment to gender equity in STEM education, we do quite a bit of national outreach activities, as well as the work that we're doing in the states that we're currently involved with. There are basically 4 methods that we use. We conduct professional development, like this webinar, certainly, and professional development in the states, person-to-person live professional development, I guess we'll call it, rather than virtual professional development. Teacher training, there's work that we do directly with teachers. If in some of the states they're doing some pilot site work, and in that case we'll be training teachers at the local level with the intent that they then would share that with their colleagues and also train others in their regions. The third is consulting and technical assistance is provided to the state teams and people who are doing professional development with using our materials. And lastly is the virtual web-based professional learning community. That's the www.stemequitypipeline.org website, where we have lots of materials and information. And I apologize for coughing, and I had the flu a couple of weeks ago, and this is the residual of it that I have been having trouble getting rid of. So let me apologize now, and I'll stop saying I'm sorry as we go on. So how can you get involved? There are 7 states currently involved in the project. And that means basically that we're doing more intensive work in these specific states, California, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Missouri, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. If you're from one of those states, I would encourage you to contact the state contact from that state to learn more about what's happening there, and also to be sure that you're signed up on the listserv. And that all can be done online at the STEM Equity Pipeline website. There's a state team page for every state, and you can get the contact information there. And, of course, to continue to participate in the virtual learning community by participating in future webinars as well as activities that we sponsor on the website itself. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the first poll. I'm always curious to know a little bit about how you all learned about this webinar. And what I'd like to ask you to do is when Greg pops the poll up here in a minute, there are going to be quite a few responses in terms of how you learned about the webinar. And if you'd select one of those responses, but then you'll notice that there are some here that have the red chat paragraphs, parentheses at the end. And if you did learn about the webinar from another listserv, not necessarily ours, from a presentation at a conference somewhere, or from an announcement in some other newsletter, or from another website besides our website, if in the chat function, in the chat function, if you would send, you can send it to all the participants, the name of the newsletter, the name of the listserv, the name of the conference, or the name of the website, that would be really helpful to give us a sense of the breadth of the impact. Greg, oh, there we go. There, the poll popped up on the right. So just pick an answer. The interesting thing about this polling function on WebEx is you've got to remember, after you've selected an answer, down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, there's a submit button. If you make your response and then hit the submit button at the bottom, then the answer will go into the system. If you don't hit the submit button, then we won't get your response. So there's a 1-minute time limit on this. The other thing to remember is if you did answer items B, D, F, or H, if you selected one of those, I would appreciate it if you would go just click on the chat line at the top of your border there on the right and enter in the little box that's in the chat screen specifically where it was that you heard about the webinar. That'll help us get a sense of where people are learning about these things. Okay, in a second, Greg is going to pop up the polling responses, but I'm going to go ahead and move on, and when the poll comes back up, we'll take a look at it. But basically, we're now ready to talk about step 5, implementing solutions. And the model that we're going to look at is up on the screen, but let's pop over and take a look at the poll. Looks like most of you are getting it from the listserv, so that's great, so that you're on the listserv registration. Somebody got it from another listserv. I would love to know what listserv that was, if you wouldn't mind popping that in the chat screen. Looks like we've got a few people who are getting forwarded from someone else. So those of you who are getting information that way, I'd recommend that you go sign up for the listserv on your own. And just to let you know, the only thing you'll receive from us on the listserv will be announcements about webinars and a once-a-month newsletter. That would be it. We don't overwhelm people with information, particularly about the project. So it looks like a few of you had no answer. You either couldn't figure out how to press the submit button or having issues with your logon. So please, if you're having any problems, you can call our offices or at 610-593-8038. Or Greg, you want to pop on and give your telephone number too, in case anyone needs to contact you about getting on the system?
Yeah, they can either, send an email, nagi.8@osu.edu, or give me a call at 614-292-7928.
All right, great, thanks. Okay, so let's talk about project management. Basically, what I want to discuss today is a little bit about how to ensure that when you implement a solution that you're managing the project appropriately so that you, at the end of the implementation process, you feel like and have been successful in implementing the project the way that you planned it, that you did it on time, that your team was all involved in the process and had a good experience, as well as having appropriate evaluation results to help you when you attempt to do this again or as the cycle continues. So the model I want us to look at is, in the project management world, is this Dare to Properly Manage Resources model. And it basically, the DPMR are the letters to remember, because we're going to talk today about defining your program or project that you're going to implement, planning it appropriately, and I'm going to give you a couple of tools that you can use, planning tools that are quite detailed, which I think are very useful in terms of really feeling like you have a handle on implementation processes. And then talk a little bit about how to manage that process, and then, of course, reviewing when you've completed the project in such a way that that feeds back into the cycle. So let's first of all look at defining, establishing project scope, and setting outcome and process objectives. For example, let's say that in the case that we're training here in this 5-step process, you've completed the first 3 of your steps. And the first step, when you did your performance gap analysis, and we're going to use this as the example throughout today's webinar to give you sort of a sense of how to use some of these tools. We discovered in our performance gap analysis that girls were not transitioning from the Gateway to Technology, which is the middle school Project Lead the Way program, to the Introduction to Engineering Design, or IED as it's called, which is one of the first high school courses that are offered in the Project Lead the Way program. But the girls weren't transitioning at the same rate as the boys, and that was one of the areas in our performance gap analysis that we felt we needed to apply an intervention or a strategy to help increase the participation rate of girls in Project Lead the Way in the school that we're looking at. Now remember, your performance gap analysis can lead you to all sorts of conclusions. This is just a sample of one that I wanted to use to give us a guideline to follow. So the next thing we did was we basically did step 2. We reviewed the root causes, and then we went out and we did some research to determine what were the barriers that these students were facing that were stopping them from transitioning from the middle school program to the high school program. Well, and this is some of the things that we found. Certainly there were others, but these were some of the major ones. One, it was the girls didn't think that the curriculum was for them. There were strong messages for some reason during the year in which they were involved with the GTT program that basically when they got to the high school, that was a program that was not something that they should be or interested in. They didn't think they were qualified to take the high school program. Another message that came from somewhere, they weren't familiar with the high school program. In other words, they hadn't really had that chance to learn about it, to understand whether or not it was something they wanted to get involved in. They also felt that the program at the high school was primarily boys anyway. There was a lack of role models that were there. There was some sense that this pre-engineering program was not for them because they didn't see girls participating, as well as they didn't know that women became engineers anyway. And lastly, that there was strong parental influence on student course selection in that transition process from middle school to high school, and it appeared as though there were girls who were having difficulty, or whose parents were having difficulty also with the same issues the girls were having in terms of making those choices. So, again, then going back to take a look at some of those root causes and trying to identify a strategy, what we decided in our planning team was that we were going to, one of the things we know is that girls typically don't step outside the boundaries without a personal limitation. So that was one of the things that we wanted to try to implement here, was to extend the personal limitations to girls to take the high school Project Lead the Way program. to personally invite them in some way. We needed to also educate parents about the benefits of the program. We also needed to educate them about the opportunities for their daughters in engineering, as well as to educate the daughters about their opportunities in engineering. We wanted to inform the girls about the Project Lead the Way curriculum, and also to provide role models and peer support for them in some way. So basically what we decided to do was to implement a program, a day-long program, that we would hold either on a weekend, or it certainly could be an adopted piece that would be an evening reception as well, to get the girls involved in this project. So I want to share with you, let's see if I can remember how to do this. Can you, Greg, you have to help me.
I see your welcome to the web tour.
Okay, are you up there? All right, so everybody can see that. That's good. So
yep.
What I want to do is go to the NAEP website. Can you see that little recorded sharing box, or is that not showing up on anybody's screen? You're okay? You can see? There's nothing in the middle of your, only the website is that what you see?
The recording panel is there.
You can see that. I don't know how to get rid of that.
You have to kind of move it away. It doesn't disappear. If you can grab the top of it and move it.
Okay, I'll move it up to the top. That's good.
There you go.
Okay, so this is the NAEP website. And the NAEP website, of course, contains all kinds of really good information. But one of the most current things that we've just put up is a piece on how to do this kind of a strategy. So I'm going to click over here on the right-hand side. You can see it says Engineering Equity Extension Service. This is a project that we're doing with the National Academies of Engineering. And we recently worked with them and with Project Lead the Way and developed this piece called Focus Your Future. It's a girls' reception toolkit. And it basically, I'm going to click on this and take you to it. It's an event for recruiting girls into pre-engineering programs. And the toolkit contains a handbook on steps in planning and conducting a reception, pre-planning activities, sample announcements, evaluation, thank you notes, sign-in sheets. There's a sample budget and a PowerPoint presentation for use at the actual event. And this is specifically a piece that we developed with Project Lead the Way. So this is specifically focused on that type of a program. You could certainly adapt all of these materials for any other kind of event or activity that where you want to try to do outreach to girls to personally encourage them to participate. Just following the same process as what's in this would be a really good resource. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. I'm going to exit the web browser sharing now and go back to our PowerPoint. Hopefully everybody can see that. So this is the strategy that we've selected, is Focus Your Future. Now, the very first thing that your planning group really needs to do is to identify who all the stakeholders are in this particular activity. And the reason you do this first thing right off the bat is you want to be sure that your implementation team contains members of all of the stakeholder groups to ensure that your event meets the needs of all your stakeholder groups as well. Now, you may find that some of these people, for example, might serve in more of an advisory capacity, or they may actually participate in the event itself. But what's really important is that as you're planning, you want to be sure that let me close this. You want to be sure that all of these people are involved in the planning process in order to keep the stakeholders all engaged. So this is called a project scope diagram. Now, the terminology I'm going to use is all in the project management theory. If any of you have done any project management work or have read any books on, the Project Management for Dummies is a great book. I'd encourage you to get it if any of you are looking at managing something like this. But this is basically a project scope diagram. And what we've done here is Focus Your Future is the activity, and we've identified all the stakeholders. So we've got middle school girls certainly are going to be the recipients. You'll notice the arrow goes to them of this activity. One of the things we're going to do in this activity is have women engineers on a panel and have them engage with the girls during the activity, and so they will participate. But the other thing is this is a really good outreach activity to women engineers in the community to hopefully get them more involved in the Project Lead the Way program in the future. So with these arrows going both directions there. We want the principal at the school to be involved because that is the person who's going to actually send or actually write, or the invitation to this event will come from someone in the principal in this case, but it needs to be someone in the administration who's a person of leadership that sort of raises the bar of the event. Certainly teachers on campus are going to be either participating or will be involved in providing input about recommendations for students to participate. We want the high school girls that are in the Project Lead the Way program to participate in this activity as role models for, let's say, for example, one of the things we do is we set up a series of hands-on workshops for the girls to participate in that would be led by girls who are currently in the Project Lead the Way program. Counselors need to be also involved in this activity as a way to do outreach to the girls who are invited, to also potentially assist with follow-up for the invitations. And Project Lead the Way teachers would also be involved too. And then parents will be invited to participate, but you may want to consider having a parent serve on your planning team. So one of the things that this process makes you do right off the bat is to make sure you identify all the stakeholders who are involved in the project. So the first thing to do would be to develop a project scope diagram and make sure you understand the scope of the project. Now remember, the next thing that happens is, of course, you need to take a look at the team that you've brought together. And remember, in steps 1, 2, and 3, you had a group of people who you're working with in your planning process who may be more planners than doers. So you want to review your team's composition for stakeholder representation based on your project scope diagram, which you would have done with your planning group. And for example, let's say you are in a situation where you did pilot this in a single location and now you're rolling out into a larger situation. You would want to have anyone who was involved in the pilot certainly involved in this implementation team. But the thing about step 4 and step 5, which sometimes I often think about them sort of together, is you may be in a situation where piloting is not appropriate because you're only going to be doing this in a single site. It's not something that's a statewide initiative, or you're in a district that's really large. And so I'm addressing step 5 more from the implementation process angle that actually could apply even if you're looking at implementing in a pilot site situation. That's how I'm going to focus today's work. Remember again, you'll be inviting new members, and that these people need to be the doers, the worker bees, for implementing the work on the ground. Now, for those of you who participated last month in the Step 4 webinar on pilot testing and evaluation, we talked about evaluation, and I want to review a couple of things because it applies here again. Because one of the things you need to do immediately at the very beginning of your implementation phase is to develop both your process measures and your outcome measures as part of your formative and your summative evaluation. And in review, I want to remind you that both of these types of measures are important. And it's important to not get them confused, and it's also important to remember that you need to do both of them. Oftentimes we get very sort of bound up in the process measurement approach and sometimes overlook our outcome measurements, or the opposite may occur as well. And so remember, process measures are things about how well was the program implemented. And included in that is things like how many people showed up for an event, or how did you stay in your timeline, was your planning group happy with what happened, but they're process measures. Outcome measures are more about what happens as an effect of the activity that you implement or the program that you're implemented. and so they're different. I'm going to go now to a poll, and I want you to tell me what type of evaluation measurement is this objective. 50 women will participate in the mentoring workshop on Saturday, June 15th. Is that a formative evaluation? Are we measuring process here, or is this a summative evaluation? Would you consider this to be an outcome, an effect of the activity? Greg will pop the poll up on the right-hand screen in just a minute, and you can answer the questions. But I'm going to go ahead and move on and talk about the next screen while you're doing that. Because, again, this is a review for those of you who participated last month. But for those of you this is new, you can answer the question quickly. Don't forget to press the submit button, and I'll talk about short-term measures and long-term measures. And first of all, about outcome measurements. If we're looking at the effect of an activity or program or an event, there are short-term effects and more long-term effects. So short-term measurements might be things like, did the activity increase someone's awareness? Did it increase their knowledge? Did it change their attitude, or did it change their behavior in the short term a little bit? Long-term measurements might be more like, did we see a change in enrollment? Did it increase test scores or grades? Were students more likely to complete a program as a result of participating in this piece? Graduation certainly is an outcome measurement, and certainly transition to employment or transition to post-secondary education as an, particularly in a certain career field or major might also be a measurement of an outcome. So going back to the poll, what type of evaluation measurement is this objective? We had 16 out of 32, but 50-something percent decided it was a formative evaluation, a process measure, and 16% of you said it was a summative measure. And that's the difficulty about attendance as a measurement of evaluation. And that really, in my mind, and certainly in most of the research that I've read, this is really a process measure. In the case where we're doing an activity that we're attempting to create some change in behavior, the number of people who show up to the event is not a relative outcome measure. It's really more about how good were we at reaching out to folks, which is about process. This is different than in a medical research event or something where you want to know how many people participated in a certain trial or how many received the vaccine. That certainly is part of the efficacy of the outcome of the event or the activity, but certainly in this case, when we talk about trying to change behavior or outcome measurements like we just discussed, this is really something dealing more with process. So remember, 1,000 people showing up at your Saturday activity and we all had a good time is really not a measure of an outcome. It's a measure of process. So process measures might be things like attendance, the response rate to a survey, for example, or to an invitation, the satisfaction of the implementers with the process. Were we happy with how things went? Or the satisfaction of the participants with the process. Were they happy with how things went, satisfied with the speakers they heard? Or, and how many of us evaluate the location of the event or the food that we had or whether or not the room was hot or cold enough? And, sometimes I laugh when I think about that because I know I've done that too. But it's really not an evaluation question that is relevant to the efficacy of the event, of course, unless it's a distracting piece. But satisfaction that the participants have with the process is also important. Did you accomplish the task on time? What about quality measurements of the implementation of the services? Could also be considered process measures. So these are all things to consider when defining your evaluation for conducting a program or any kind of a project. Remember again to write SMART objectives. They should be specific. They should be measurable, which usually means a number in there of some kind. Of course, achievable, which means realistic. They need to be relevant to the activity that you're doing. Don't try to measure something that is not relevant to the implementation that you're attempting to apply, and that they're time limited. In other words, that there's some date upon which that you expect that outcome or process to occur. So let's look at a couple of measurements for this Focus Your Future event that we're using as a sample here. And the planning team got together, and these were a couple of the evaluation objectives they wanted to put out there. For outcome measures, they wanted to see in the short term that after participating in the Focus Your Future event, 50% of the participating students will show a 1-point on a 5-point Likert scale increase in their willingness to consider enrolling in the pre-engineering program at the high school. Very specific measurement. The second this is a more long-term outcome, and there may have been other short-term outcomes. You can have multiple ones, certainly. A long-term outcome in this case would be that the high school pre-engineering programs would increase participation of girls by 5% the year following the implementation of the very first Focus Your Future event. Of course, assuming that this event would occur multiple years. And here were some of the process objectives the planning team, the implementation team decided that they wanted to measure. They wanted 75% of the invitees to respond to the invitation by the RSVP date. Another process objective was 60% of the invitees will attend the event. Another one was 50% of the participants will bring at least one parent or guardian to the event. Another process objective that the implementation team came up with was 75% of the participants will score their satisfaction with the event as a 4, very good, or a 5, excellent, on the exit evaluation instrument. So those are all process objectives. And you'll notice they're very different than the outcome objectives. They're really more about the actual activity itself and the processes that we use. And you can come up with all kinds of process objectives that may be helpful. So the first thing to do with this is to develop some kind of an evaluation plan. And this is a model that we use in the projects that I'm involved in, certainly identifying your objectives, identifying the method that you're going to measure that objective. In this case, for example, the first one, 75% of the invitees respond to the invitation by the RSVP date. We'll know that by the response rate. And Henry, and you'll see later on, Henry has lots of responsibility here. Henry is going to be responsible for reviewing this and answering this question, because it just so happens Henry is involved with the management of the invitation process. And then you'll notice there's a timeline or milestone. In this case, they're numbered 1, 2, 3, and I'll explain this to you because this relates to another tool that we'll use a little bit further in the process here. But keep this in mind, that an evaluation plan, basically, you want to identify the objective, the method for collecting the evaluation, and who's going to be responsible for that, and in what timeline or milestone place will that occur. And these here are the process objectives upon which we stated before, and you would do the same thing for your outcome objectives as well. So basically what we've done is now we've defined the project. We've established the project scope. We've looked at stakeholders. We've broadened our implementation team if necessary. And we've set some very specific outcome and process objectives for the implementation of our strategy. So the next thing we need to do is we need to plan. We have to create a schedule, assign people and resources, and draw up some kind of a budget. So let's take a look at some tools that we can use that would be helpful in the planning process. I don't know how many of you have ever used one of these before, but this is an example of a work breakdown structure. This is just a generic one, a sample that I received out of a publication. But basically, the idea is to try to take the activities of a project and break it down to its lowest common item. And I've done that here for our Focus Your Future event. Hopefully, I know this is very small typing and it may be difficult to read, but I think you'll get the gist of the idea if you look closely at your computer screen. As far as Well, let me stop for a second because I see that I have a question, and I know Lori's saying don't interrupt to answer, but I do think that this is a good question. One of the things she asked is achievable goals. How do you balance that with challenging goals, especially with increasing female participation? Don't we really need to reach higher than achievable? And I will say to her, yes. And Lori, I know you well, and I appreciate the challenge here. I do think that one of the most difficult things in the implementation process is to sit down and be really clear about what your objectives are, and to set objectives out there that you feel are certainly relevant and reachable, but that they are achievable as well. I mean, I think the thing about the non-trad we know is that it moves, it's a measurement that moves slowly. But if we don't set the bar high, again, and raise our expectations about what we think we can accomplish, I think oftentimes we might underestimate our abilities to accomplish these kinds of goals. And so, you know, it's a balancing act is, I guess, the best way I can say, and realize that you may set goals for yourself that are certainly you don't reach sometimes. And so, but the fact that you are improving, that's probably the most important thing, is to ensure that what you're seeing is an improvement. Because if your event or your activity or program is not creating an improvement, you need to go back to the drawing board because something somewhere in the process didn't get identified correctly, whether it was a root cause you missed or you selected the wrong strategy. You know, it's a process. It's constantly reviewing that process. So one of the things that's probably really important in this is when you selected your strategy is to be sure that that you're really clear about what the tasks are that need to be accomplished, because there's nothing worse than standing at an event, watching something happen, and saying to yourself, oh, well, we should have. Why didn't I? The evaluation didn't do this. Oh, I never thought about that. You know, all of those kinds of things. So really taking time ahead of time is important. So although a work breakdown structure, as I describe it to you here, you may think, oh, my gosh, the detail in this is crazy. Or, you know, I don't have time to do this sort of thing. You don't have time to not do this sort of thing because in the end, this kind of work right up front when you're going to implement an event or some kind of a program is really important because what it's doing is it's documenting, in addition to giving you really good planning, it's documenting everything you've done. So when you go to repeat this again, if it's a successful thing and you repeat it again, it's really easy to implement the second time because you have it all documented. So, for example, in this Focus Your Future activity, I've identified a couple of specific things that we want to accomplish. We want to invite middle school girls. We want to invite parents. We're going to develop a program. We're certainly going to evaluate. And then what I've done is done a string for you of the subtasks underneath this specific strategy that you're going to work on as part of your Focus Your Future event. So we need to obtain teacher recommendations for participants. You'll notice this is number 1.1, so it's a sub-task under task number 1. 1.2, principal writes personal invitation to the girls. We print the invitations, create the mailing list, send the invitation, collect the RSVPs, and follow up with non-responders. Same sort of string of tasks deal with inviting the parents, and you'll notice that there are actually 2 tasks. This one is creating mailing lists and collecting RSVPs that are common to these 2 strings. Certainly, developing the program will be a much more complicated string, certainly, and you can go back and take a look at your evaluation plan in terms of developing your evaluation instruments and things here. But this is just to give you a sense of what you would do here in terms of a work breakdown structure. There's all kinds, if you're really into this sort of stuff, there's all kinds of software out there that exists that will do this work for you. Microsoft has something they call Microsoft Project that develops work breakdown structures from tasks that you identify and then builds them into some of these other things we're going to talk about in just a minute. So if you go online and take a look at project software, project management software, there's lots of even free downloadable pieces that are available too. But this will give you a sense. And after you start to do this, then what you'll do with these things is you'll develop a task list. Now, some of you may say to yourself, oh, that looks more familiar to me. Often this is where I start. But, you know, if you actually do it with the team in a in a flowchart process like this, you'll probably notice more often where you're going to see commonalities of tasks that need to be done, as well as probably get to the level of detail that's more relevant to your work. So you're going to develop this task list. You're going to identify then how long is it going to take to do each of these tasks. Now realize some of them are short. May only take the principal an hour, maybe less, to write the invitation. But you want to do this so that you can estimate the length of time that it's going to require to do the various tasks. And then you also want to be sure that you note which tasks are dependent on what other tasks. For example, you can't print the invitations before the principal writes the invitations. You can't create the mailing list before you obtain the teacher recommendations. You can't send invitations to the girls before you print the invitations. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to people. And the purpose of doing this is so that as we move on, we're going to talk about timelines here, that you're sure you get your tasks in an order that's appropriate, because you can do multiple tasks at the same time, but ones that are dependent one on the other cannot be done simultaneously. They have to be done in a string. So you'll develop a task list. The next thing you want to do is a timeline, and I've always called these timelines, this is more formally a Gantt chart, for those of you who would like to do more research on project management. There's a great website on the Gantt project. You can download Gantt timeline software for free and do all sorts of things. But this is a sort of a generic Gantt chart. We've got person 1, person 2, and the tasks that they're going to accomplish, and the month and day. And those of you who've done any grant writing have probably done Gantt charts or timelines many times. But for our activity, here's that same list of tasks, just repeated here. And some of you may be thinking, oh, I could do this in Excel. You could. It's very simple. And what I've done here is you'll notice that these are in different colors because these green represent someone, blue represents someone, red, you remember red was Henry back there in that evaluation plan. And so in this Gantt chart, we've got 3 people that are working on these specific tasks. Now remember, the flow chart that we had for our work breakdown structure, your task list is going to be really long. I couldn't show this on a slide, but you get the sense. And it just so happens that you'll find yourself as you're going along, you'll know that there are what we call milestones. This is the first milestone in the project based on our evaluation plan. So think about this for a second, what we've done here. We want to obtain teacher recommendations, and Susan's going to do that. That's the person in green. The principal is going to write the invitations. I can't remember the principal's name. We'll find out in a minute here. And then the next activity, this is week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The next activity is Henry is going to print the invitations, create the mailing list, and send the invitations to the girls all in this week. And also for the parents, all in the same time. And the principal is writing the invitations to the parents and the girls at the same time. Then we're going to collect RSVPs. We're going to give a 3-week window for RSVP responses. And then we're going to follow up. We've got Susan and Henry doing follow-up with the non-responders because we want to make that RSVP rate go up. And then remember our very first process evaluation item was we wanted 75% of the students and parents to RSVP by the deadline for the RSVP. So this is the first evaluation milestone. And so Henry, if you recall, was in charge of that particular evaluation. He has to then calculate this for us to see whether we're on track. And certainly one of the things that you're going to want to include in your Gantt chart, which I don't have here, is planning meetings for the team to meet. And this would be a really good time for a planning meeting to review the response and what's going on in terms of response rates to the evaluation. So that's a first milestone place. And of course, there were other milestones that we had earlier, evaluation points, and those would all be included on your Gantt chart. Of course, you also want to develop a budget. You can do this using, this is the exact same list of tasks. And then we have budget categories, copying, postage, and phone in this case for these particular tasks. And we estimate a cost for each of these items. You would do this for your entire task list. And then you could automatically from this build the budget. And if you are really good about being sure that at the very beginning you identified through your work breakdown structure all of the tasks that makes the whole planning process very simple. So here's a quick poll. Which of the following project management tools have you used in the past, for those of you who are involved with managing projects? Have you done a work breakdown structure? Have you ever used a Gantt chart? Or you've maybe are experienced at this and you've used both of them in some of your planning. I have to admit that I do a lot of planning work and I don't always do a work breakdown structure. I did actually for the STEM Equity Pipeline project, and it's been very helpful. But I do know when I do this, and I take the time ahead of time to do this, that the implementation of activities is much better. I have a better ability to manage what's going on, and I certainly feel certainly much more in control if that's a goal. And it gives you a chance to really certainly replicating what you're doing is a lot easier, as well as evaluating how it went. So it looks like the poll is closed. We'll see what kind of response rate we got up here, see how experienced project managers we have on the call. And just to refresh our memories, we've looked at defining the project, we've looked at planning our project or program. And remember, this can be a full-blown program to a single event. You can use this exact same process. We've created a schedule, we've assigned people and resources, and drawn up a budget basically built off of the work breakdown structure that we did at the very beginning. And that's sort of a key component to this.
And Mimi, I think a lot of people missed the first poll because I published it while you were talking, so I'm putting it out right now again.
Okay, so if everyone would go ahead and go back to the poll, it should be up on the right-hand side, and answer the question, which of the following project management tools have you used? A work breakdown structure, Gantt chart, or both? And don't forget to press the submit button on the bottom right-hand side. I'm sorry I'm distracting people from completing the poll. You have about 4 seconds left to respond. 3, 2, 1, 0. All right, well, we'll see what that looks like. And then, so it looks like we have 4 people who've used the work breakdown structure, 2 who've used the Gantt chart, we've got 7 who've used both, a few people who aren't responding. So that's good. Looks like we have some experience with these. I guess I maybe should have put a response item as I've never used any of these tools. We probably can't assume that all 20 of the no answers are in that boat, but many of you may not. I know that project management is something that I'm learning to do as I get more involved in bigger programs, but these tools are really helpful regardless of the size of the work that you're doing. So let's quickly talk a little bit about managing. You've got to control the work and the progress, provide feedback to the group. Negotiating resource certainly is important. But we follow the same ideas here. Again, the same task list from our work breakdown structure. What are the resources? There may be some specific resources that are needed in order to accomplish some of these tasks. And as the project manager, if you're the one who's in charge, or as a person on the committee, at least you'll know where you need to go to gather these things. And in this case, remember we said that teachers were going to make recommendations about the girls who should participate in this event. And Susan, who's responsible for that, she's the one who was the green person on the Gantt chart, is going to have to develop a teacher survey. So remember, one of the things that somewhere in this piece, back in the work breakdown structure, we should have had a teacher survey string that went out so that Susan knew the task to follow to accomplish the development of this teacher survey in order to get the recommendations back. Or maybe, she may do it in a different way, depending on what needs to be done. But we've got specific due dates, and as a manager, this is a really important tool because one of the things that you can do is to maintain, or even if you're doing this as a team so that everyone is accountable to each other, is to maintain on your regular planning meetings the status of each of these pieces. And it helps remind people about when they need to get something accomplished by. And there's nothing better than, deadline dates. I love those things because they force me to do something. It's so easy to get distracted and doing other things, and deadlines are very helpful. Jane happens to be the principal. You recall the person in blue in the Gantt chart who's writing these invitations. And Henry, looks like Henry's got the task of printing invitations, but there's very specific dates. Henry needs to get addresses for these students and their parents, and of course, contact information for following up with the non-responders. And, you know, again, this would be completed including all the tasks that end up coming out of the work breakdown structure. So project tracking spreadsheets are very helpful. Again, you could do this in Excel. You could easily do these in a series of worksheets in Excel and just have your single task list, cut and paste them onto each of these pieces. So, and that's a very simple process about managing, and I think what's really important in the managing process is to have a very good communication schedule with dealing with the people that you're working with, and regular times throughout your planning phases that you meet. It doesn't necessarily have to be in person. You could do conference calls, or maybe it's email communications. You may have an online SharePoint site, for example, where you're sharing information back and forth and managing that way. There's lots of ways to do this in the environment in which we now live, which is great. So lastly, let's take a look quickly at reviewing, analyzing evaluation results, holding a post-review, and documenting successes and failures. And again, this review process is based on the evaluation report or the evaluation objectives that you set at the very beginning of your implementation process. These are the exact same evaluation objectives that we set up at the very beginning of the webinar. 75% of the invitees will respond to the invitation by the RSVP date. These should look familiar, et cetera. And the method, you remember this from our evaluation plan, this is the method. And the person who was responsible for each of these would prepare the narrative that would go in this result box, and so the idea is that then could be reported out to the entire team at a review meeting. But it's very clear about how we're going to collect this, where it was collected, and then the results can be reported. Again, a very simple spreadsheet table type of format. So we want to take a look at the evaluation outcomes, but at the same time, we also want to look at the results of the project implementation. Did we get things done on time? And you remember when we talked about managing, this same spreadsheet had, instead of results here, had this status column. And as things got accomplished in the status phase from the management process, those would have been the actual dates when those things were completed, and any kind of notes about challenges or successes that maybe they had as a result of implementing that task. That sort of thing would be kept in the project tracking spreadsheet so that this would be, at the end of the project, would be completed, and the review team could take a look at this. And these are sort of the two review documents that you would want to look at, the evaluation report and the project tracking spreadsheet to measure the success in terms of the implementation of the project. Now remember, going back to the evaluation report, that many of these process outcomes or process objectives you will be able to report on immediately following the event because they're all basically measuring the process of the implementation. The summative evaluation or the outcome evaluation that we talked about earlier, you'll recall it had to do with well, one of them, actually, you would be able to report immediately upon the completion of the event. If you remember what that measure was, it had to do with change in attitude about the likelihood of them enrolling, the Likert scale, moving up the Likert scale in the evaluation instrument. So that outcome would be one you could measure immediately. The other outcome measure, you recall, was one dealing with looking at enrollment the year following this event. So, you know, the thing that's difficult in those kind of measurements is to remember that that's something you want to look at when the time comes when it's appropriate. So again, evaluation needs to occur over a long-term process, and we need to remind ourselves about points in time when we want to go take a look at data. But the funny thing about that is what that does is it sort of feeds us right back into the 5-step process. And what happens is it moves us right into step one. We're now back at the point where we're going to document performance results and take a look at whether or not our intervention actually created the change that we wanted. And if it did, the good news is you can just keep cycling back to step 5. Step 1 to step 5 without doing the others. If the intervention did not create the effect we want, then it's really time to go back to the drawing board and review what you identified through the root cause process and selection of solutions to determine whether or not the implementation strategy you selected was appropriate. So the cycle can sort of move from step 1 back to step 5 if you're successful, assuming you're making circles here. I don't know if you can see me doing that, actually. Let's say going from here to here. Or you might be in a situation where you're going to have to go and move back through the circle again if your implementation strategy was not effective. But this is a place that you want to be, is moving from step 1 to step 5 to step 1 to step 5, step 1 to step 5, as you implement strategies that are successful. Okay, so let me answer Buzz's question. What software do I like? Well, Buzz, I actually have developed a spreadsheet that I use for our project management that I shared with you here. I do this basically in Excel. And that's primarily because I looked a little bit at Microsoft Project, and I do think it has some great capacities. It's a little pricey, and it probably is much more complicated than what we need in this kind of the environment in which we're working. I mean, I'm not developing widgets to send thousands of them to China or something like that, which is most of those software packages are built that way. But I don't know, is there anyone on the call that has a recommendation that they would want to post up on the, you could put it in the Q&A, give us your recommendation if any of you use project management software that you like. Or Buzz, even if you have software that you'd like, I'd like to hear about it. I have also looked at the Gantt project has some good free downloadable software that's available, and I have used Gantt chart software from there that I've found useful too.
Mimi,
Eva, Dot Project is an open source solution. Great. I would encourage everyone to go take a look at that. It sounds like Eva's recommending it, and I will too, Eva. Thank you very much.
Mimi, you have a question by Leslie?
Buzz? That's Buzz.
She raised, that was,
Buzz asked what software do I like, and I answered that.
Okay, thank you.
And Visio is a software package that helps with developing Gantt charts and various other types of diagrams, but it doesn't do the full project management. So that's Brenda Leising. Brenda, thanks for sharing that with us, too. Actually, I have not looked at Visio. I've noticed that Microsoft Project Management, or Microsoft Project talks about being compatible with Visio, but I have not actually looked closely at that. So, again, I've sort of adapted things that meet the needs for the sizes of projects that we implement, which are not big, huge things. And sometimes I think that adaptability is helpful. And Excel does that for us fairly well. Any other questions, comments for the good of the order? Well, let me just say that I hope for those of you who participated in all of the 5 webinars now for the 5-step process, that you found this to be informative and useful in terms of implementing activities that you think, let me clear that, implementing activities that will have potential for success. I do believe that as we're pilot testing this process in a lot of places across the country, and we've actually seen it work in some programs that we've worked in some of the states, that we'll learn more and more about how better to do this, which we will share with you as we move forward. But again, let me just remind you how easy it is to jump to the silver bullet solution without doing adequate research to really understand the barriers that students are facing and preparing programs and activities that will eliminate those barriers, and evaluating your effectiveness so that you know if what you're doing really is working. I can't say that enough, that I hope that, if nothing else, you will all be much more conscious about that process and work through it, although I know that it's an arduous one. I encourage you, good work is never easy. So, if you have any questions in the future, please don't hesitate to contact me and or send an email. You can see that you can reach me at these numbers here. At this, my email address is there, and that's probably the best way to contact me. Okay, Greg, I guess I'll turn it back to you for any closing remarks and housekeeping.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. Thank you all for joining us today. Remember, this webinar will be available on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website under the Professional Development heading and then under Archive Webinars in the next few days. When you close your WebEx program, a few survey questions will open in your web browser that we would like for you to answer for us. Thank you for your time.